Good morning, Dan and Amy. All right, we've got a treat for you here. Coming up, we've got The Godfather. We've got CNBC's Rick Santelli, on-air editor for CNBC. And I just want to prepare people.
Okay.
Because it's like a tour de force when you talk to a godfather like Rick Santelli. You remember about 6 weeks before the election, the Obama administration generated a run on Deutsche Bank? Almost precipitated the collapse of Deutsche Bank because they're shaking down banks for fines, $14 billion they wanted. Here was Rick Santelli on CNBC reacting to that in part.
What if the central banks all get together and decide, well, okay, we don't want that to happen, let's buy Deutsche Bank. Or when any other bank or company is in trouble, we'll buy that. Or as you get to political highlight points like election times, you want to keep everything pretty clean, make sure nothing goes down. Is that the world we really want to live in? Here's where I'm going with this. Janet Yellen recently, and it's all over every blog and every tongue of every trader, is considering the costs and benefits of doing things like other central banks. Maybe buying equities, maybe buying corporates. It's a bad idea. It's not only the fact of who gets to pick and choose, it will completely and utterly, in every possible way, destroy any value in the marketplace. Completely. It'll be a useless investment. What good is it without price discovery, without people getting together and using the markets to either add to risk or dispense of their risk to actually get a large group of individuals, whether in a group or on an electronic platform, to bid and offer and come up with a true price reflecting the fundamentals of whatever they're trading? A backstop by central banks is not only horrible, and the final joke here is that in order for Janet Yellen and company to do any of that, they would go and have to get permission from Congress. I will just leave it at that. Think about that congressional hearing.
That's why they call him the Godfather, or at least we do here out in the hustings. Rick Santelli, CNBC on-air editor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now, before we begin on the substance, I have to say we were in Maxfield's in Lombard, Amy and I, having breakfast with a couple of listeners yesterday, and we saw a Rick Santelli signed picture.
8x10 glossy.
Yeah. In Maxfield's.
Looking pretty tight, huh?
And we demanded that our 8x10 glossy be put up next year, so I hope you take no offense.
Oh, none at all.
Yeah.
Boy, they have some good food. Their skirt steak is delicious.
Yeah,
see, I should have ordered that, Rick. I was so close to getting it.
All right, Maxfield's and Lombard skirt steak. You've heard it here first, Rick Santelli. All right, Rick, so that was you talking about Janet Yellen once upon a time, just 6 weeks ago. What about the Fed's decision yesterday to bump interest rates by a quarter point?
You know, it just astonishes me that investors have gotten so enamored putting their money back to work in the marketplace even before President-elect is sworn in on the 20th. Why is that, you think, Dan and Amy? Well, most likely because investors are looking at some very simple metrics of the political landscape. The Senate, Republican. The House, Republican. The President, Republican. They've been working on issues regarding tax policy. They've been working on issues regarding rolling back regulations that are like saddlebags on a burro, overloading the animal inability to make much movement, especially uphill. And, of course, that's an analogy for the economy. And investors like what they see. Low-hanging fruit. We're going to maybe make government a little smaller, streamline the process. Janet Yellen yesterday hardly mentioned the close to 9.5% move in equities to the upside. The move in interest rates, that's for a good reason. Rates are going up because it looks like growth has a possibility to pick up. All these things are good things. Janet Yellen and company hardly mention them. Listen, I understand the Federal Reserve is an institution that doesn't want to be too optimistic without seeing facts, but not to acknowledge this, in my opinion, was a confidence buster yesterday. I think the Fed should have tipped their hat to what investors seem to know a little bit more about than the Fed, and that is the fairy dust in the system is quite important to the entire process of markets and growth.
And as part of the confidence boost that you're describing, the result of the selections Trump has made for important cabinet posts?
Well, listen, politics isn't really my venue unless it kind of stampedes into the markets. And I think the cabinet process, to me, the way I look at it is, if you're anti-regulation and you think that's been a weight on the economy, now let's look at where all these regs come from. They come from places like the EPA, National Labor Relations Board. Many of Donald Trump's picks are individuals that are going to go against the momentum of those kind of fourth branch of government agencies. And in that regard, I think none of this should be a surprise. That's why the people put him in office. That's why the people in the UK kicked out Brussels. That's why the people in Italy voted out the Renzi referendum. There is a reason Donald Trump is there, and he is just fulfilling the promise that he basically made to people to halt some of these issues and their momentum as it takes away from the economy.
All right, so the Federal Reserve raised interest rates for a second time in a decade. Once the Trump team, and of course Donald Trump becomes from president-elect to president of the United States, do you see another interest rate coming anytime soon?
I'll tell you what, I think that the U.S. Federal Reserve is doing the right thing. They're doing it too slow. They're probably doing it in too small of increments. But I think that the transition into the Trump administration will not impede that process. Now, my guess is that Donald Trump has expressed his own opinions regarding the Federal Reserve and how they operate, and Janet Yellen. I think those issues are a bit separate. I know her tenure will run out in early 2018. She expressed yesterday in the post-Fed decision press conference she fully anticipates to play through her entire term. I wouldn't doubt that would be the case. But just like the way current President Obama sort of signaled various things, for example, to the Department of Justice regarding Hillary's emails. You can have a president that isn't going to fire people, isn't going to make too much noise, but I think there's little doubt that he does send and has sent messages with regard to his opinions on the Federal Reserve and the leader of the Federal Reserve, Chairperson Yellen.
But ultimately, growth next year and in years to come is going to be more of a function of the fiscal policy decisions made by the president and Congress than it is Janet Yellen or any other Fed chairman.
Oh, absolutely. I'm telling you, Dan, you could put that on the marquee of the Chicago Theater. That's what has kind of given me fuel for the last 5+ years. The notion that you can't spin straw into growth. The Federal Reserve can try to do various things. They could try to make the landscape a little bit better. But ultimately, the structural issues that have impeded our economy can't be dealt with by low interest rates, easy money, and picking and choosing various programs that seem to have benefited those that they wanted to penalize in the very beginning. Too big to fail banks, the 1%. I have nothing against the 1%, but I do think that if we look at all the arguments from 2010 and 11 regarding Wall Street and Main Street, that much of the medicine that has been relegated out by some of the agencies and groups like the Federal Reserve certainly didn't accomplish the mission. What accomplishes the mission is the fiscal side, and I think some of the Fed's activities over the last handful of years have actually enabled the Congress not to do their job, the job that Trump is most likely going to get them to do.
Now, I know you're not much for political theater, but when you've got $3 trillion worth of CEOs in a room and the president-elect, you got to take notice. So his tech exec summit yesterday, in which he said, among other things, did Trump, and we're going to do fair trade deals. We're going to make it a lot easier for you to trade across borders because a lot of the restrictions, a lot of the problems that I think you'll see. So on the one hand, he seems to be talking about relieving companies of regulatory burdens. On the other hand, fair trade is kind of signaling language as well. I wonder what your takeaway from that confab yesterday was.
My opinion is that some of the big multinational companies may indeed have a bit of a harder time. And not all of that is because President-elect Trump is trying to, in my opinion, create a baseline for future negotiations. Let's just take something even more simple. The U.S. Federal Reserve rates, as you pointed out, for the second time in 10 years. And I think that they're going to be on a path to continue to normalize / raise rates, get them up to a level more appropriate with the economy because we're not in a crisis anymore. all of those activities are going to make the U.S. dollar stronger. It's a pretty simple concept. If our rates are going up, capital is going to go to the country whose rates are highest. Just that alone is going to create an impediment on the export side for multinational corporations shipping goods all over the world, because a stronger dollar means our prices for our exports are going to go up. So I think it's complicated, and unfortunately, sometimes there's winners and losers. Even in a marketplace where you don't have too few individuals making the decisions, it's better when the market makes the decisions. Not flawless, of course, but better. But I don't think that's anything to dispense the notion that things are going to get better. I think just look at labor. You know, if you can get labor in Mexico, for example, for a fraction, $7, $8, $9 versus $35 here, that's a handicap and an impediment, but I at least think President-elect Trump is going to do other things to help the playing field, especially on the tax side. So I think all those things have to be put on the scale. I do think more domestic companies and service-oriented companies may benefit more greatly than multinationals under some of what I think will be coming down the legislative pipe over the next 200 days.
You know, Rick Santelli, I still laugh election night at some of our friends who are texting saying the stock market's going to crash. What do I do? And actually, markets have closed in record territory. Do you see this lasting through the Trump presidency?
Listen, I've learned about how markets can be very complicated to predict. I've been following them very closely since '79. Nothing is linear when it comes to markets. Now, in a macro general sense, I do think there's going to be very good improvement in productivity and growth. That will be accompanied by more inflation. All of that, I think, will lead to an upward trajectory of markets, particularly in the stock market, which is always a kind of an inflationary divining rod. So if you believe there's a reflation trade under the Trump administration, stocks should help you keep up with that inflation and do move more to the upside. But we want to make sure we let viewers know nothing is linear. It's not going to be a straight line. It's not going to look like a mountain going straight up. But I do think it'll be more like a staircase. You do a certain amount up, and then you give a little bit back, but ultimately you go higher.
All right. He is Rick Santelli, on-air editor for CNBC. Rick, always enjoy you watching on CNBC and, of course, having you on the show. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights.
Oh, thanks to you, Dan and Amy. A real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.